When Anderson Cooper tried to corner Barron Trump on live TV, no one expected the young entrepreneur's unapologetic counterstrike. Barron Trump, now 23, had avoided most interviews since stepping into his expanding role as a business prodigy. Despite the worldwide curiosity surrounding him, he preferred measured appearances and rarely entertained probing questions about his personal life. But tonight, on a major network, he'd agreed to a live sit-down with Anderson Cooper, arguably one of the toughest interviewers in modern journalism. The sleek set gleamed beneath bright overhead lights. The audience hushed with anticipation. Anderson's reputation for incisive, persistent questioning was legendary, and Barron had walked in ready for anything, or so he thought. "Barron," Anderson began, flashing that famous disarming smile, "thank you for joining me tonight. There's a lot of buzz around your latest acquisitions in tech and media, but I'd like to start with something I know our audience is curious about. How did you become so successful so young?" Barron's posture remained poised, one leg crossed over the other, hands folded in his lap. "I appreciate the compliment. I've been privileged to learn from some of the best mentors in the business world, but it's not just about mentors. My success has been a combination of timing, hard work, and the willingness to stick my neck out on things I believe in." Anderson nodded, his pen hovering over the notepad perched on his knee. "You mentioned mentorship. Are you referring to your father, your mother, or professionals from outside your family?" Barron's expression shifted subtly. "I've been influenced by many, including my parents, but also by entrepreneurs and innovators who offered me insights when I was first starting out." Anderson's smile sharpened with curiosity. "There's always a fascination with your mother, her influence, her quiet yet dignified presence. Do you think her public persona overshadowed or shaped your trajectory in any way?" A faint tension flickered across Barron's face. He was used to hearing questions about his father. The press had dissected Donald Trump's every move for decades, but prodding about Melania in this context felt pointed. Still, he kept his composure. "My mother has been an incredible source of personal support and discipline. I don't know if overshadowed is the right word. She influenced me certainly, but overshadow, never." Anderson's eyes narrowed, reading the subtle shift in Barron's posture. "So you'd say she's had a more private influence, guiding you behind the scenes rather than publicly taking credit?" Barron inclined his head. "She never sought the limelight for self-promotion. She focused on her family, her initiatives, and maintaining her own sense of dignity. That was always her style." Anderson nodded thoughtfully. "Let's discuss the kind of scrutiny your mother faced and continues to face, especially from those who questioned her capabilities or her intelligence. How did that shape your perception of the media?" A flicker of exasperation passed over Barron's features. "Scrutiny is inevitable, but sometimes it crosses into misinformation or deliberate misrepresentation. That's not just about my mother. It's about public figures in general. If you're going to criticize her accent or her approach, at least acknowledge the fact that she speaks multiple languages fluently and built her own career before ever stepping into the White House." Anderson leaned in. "But Barron, some critics say that beyond her elegance, Melania Trump hasn't shown enough public engagement. They feel she remained distant, letting others do the talking. Is it fair to argue she stayed silent rather than defend herself or you when controversies arose?" Barron's gaze sharpened. "Silence doesn't always mean complacency. Sometimes it's a deliberate choice. I'd argue she spoke only when she believed it necessary, and when she did, she was heard." Anderson's expression was carefully neutral. "Then let's talk specifics. When you began your first venture into international real estate, some said it was handed to you on a silver platter, that your father pulled strings and your mother, well, she was absent from the storyline, so to speak. How did you feel about that narrative?" Barron's voice cooled. "I felt it was oversimplified. Was I privileged? Absolutely. But that doesn't negate the long hours, the frustration, and the doubts I had to overcome. As for my mother being absent from the storyline, that's just one more angle reporters use to undermine her significance. She was with me every step in ways that weren't always visible to the public." Anderson's pen tapped against his notepad. He knew Barron was not easily rattled, so he pushed a little further. "So you're saying the public underestimates Melania's role in your success. Care to elaborate?" Barron took a brief moment before answering. "Sure. She taught me the difference between confidence and arrogance. She taught me to respect people, staff, colleagues, even media personalities, until they give you a real reason not to. She's a strategist in her own right, just not in front of cameras." Anderson held his gaze. "Why do you think the media, myself included, never got that story? If she's such a strong influence, why the secrecy?" A faint smirk curved Barron's mouth. Anderson, you and I both know the media thrives on spin. My mother's story wasn't scandalous enough. She wasn't out there making controversial statements. She wasn't doing sensational interviews. She didn't feed the beast. Therefore, the beast painted her as uninteresting. That's on the media, not her. A hum of agreement rippled through the in-studio audience. They'd come expecting to see a guarded young man, but there was something disarmingly direct about Barron. Anderson shifted in his seat, crossing one leg over the other as he prepared his next angle. He glanced at his notepad and the tension in the studio seemed to tighten. The bright lights reflected off the cameras trained on Barron, capturing every subtle reaction. "All right," Anderson said, voice measured. "You've defended your mother. Let's pivot. Are you suggesting journalists like me ask misleading questions, or do we simply present what we believe is relevant?" "Sometimes it's relevant," Barron acknowledged. "Other times it's purely provocative, meant to stir headlines and get ratings. That's not exactly a secret in this industry." Anderson gave a diplomatic smile. "That's a fair point. But let's go deeper. Looking at your mother's time in the White House, some say she was overshadowed by louder figures in your family. Others say she was content avoiding the spotlight. Which is it?" Barron's tone remained cool. "She was content with her role. She has always been a person who picks her moments to speak or act. That gets labeled as passive, which is absurd. The world didn't see the countless times she provided guidance or stepped in behind the curtain. She didn't need to prove anything. She did what she felt was right." Anderson angled forward. "Then would you say the attacks on her were unwarranted?" Barron's eyes flashed. "Absolutely unwarranted. Criticize her fashion choices, her accent, fine. But the personal attacks, the insinuations about her intelligence or contributions, unnecessary and frankly baseless." Sensing an opportunity to provoke more emotion, Anderson steepled his fingers. "There have been rumors about tension within the family, especially during your teenage years. Some speculate your mother felt sidelined by the intense media scrutiny on your father. Could that have contributed to friction behind closed doors?" Barron inhaled slowly. "Every family has tensions. We're no different. But the rumors you're referring to? They're mostly speculation from unnamed sources. My mother and father have had their share of disagreements, like any couple in the public eye. But to say she felt sidelined or incompetent, that's fiction." Anderson held his gaze. "You're obviously close to your mother, so help me understand this. If she's so central to your life, why does she barely appear at your corporate events? Why not show her off as the mentor you claim she is?" Barron chuckled softly, though no humor touched his eyes. "Because she's not a trophy. She's not a prop I bring on stage to wave at crowds. She prefers a certain measure of privacy. And guess what? She's entitled to it." Anderson acknowledged the statement with a slight nod. The conversation was intensifying, but he could sense Barron's willingness to go head-to-head. "Let's talk about your business expansions. You've recently acquired a digital media company known for its conservative lean. People say you're trying to restore your family's political brand. Do you see that as building upon your mother's legacy or strictly your father's?" Barron leaned forward. "Neither. I'm building something new. Are my family's values woven into that? Yes, but that's because I share some of those values. This notion that every move I make is orchestrated by my parents is tiresome. I'm my own man." Anderson's lips twitched in a half-smile. "Your own man. Understood. Let's pivot again. Your mother was subject to what some called unwarranted attacks, accusations of complicity or hypocrisy. Do you think her background, having immigrated to the U.S., ever shielded or harmed her reputation?" Barron considered the question. Maybe it shielded her from certain types of criticism early on. Later, though, it just became another angle, like, how could an immigrant possibly align with strong American nationalist rhetoric? They pinned her as a contradiction, which was unfair. She's proud of her origins and proud of this country. Both can be true. Anderson's gaze flickered toward the studio audience, who were riveted by the unfolding confrontation. "Many see your mother as elegant yet distant. You seem determined to repaint that narrative. Is that the main reason you agreed to this interview?" Barron offered a tight-lipped grin. "I'm here because I was asked to discuss my business expansions, but it was obvious we'd talk about my mother. Everyone does. Am I trying to set the record straight? Absolutely, because the relentless speculation is tiring." Anderson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Relentless speculation is part of the territory, Barron." Barron shrugged. "Yes, it is. And calling it out is also part of the territory." Anderson decided to push the envelope. "If you had one statement to make on behalf of Melania Trump to correct any misconception, what would it be?" Barron paused, letting a stretch of silence heighten the tension. I'd say, don't confuse quiet resolve with passivity. She never needed to shout or posture to be influential. And anyone who assumes she's just an accessory to my father is missing the bigger picture. Anderson gave a slow nod, flipping to another page of notes. Before we move on, let's address a rumor that your mother regretted her time in the White House. Some outlets claimed she felt trapped. Have you ever heard her express that regret to you? Barron's expression darkened. Never once. She had concerns about privacy and the frenzy that comes with political life. But regret? No. She doesn't regret standing by her husband, and she doesn't regret the effort she invested in her initiatives. An awkward hush descended. Anderson recognized that he was dancing close to a line that might set Barron off. The show's staff watched nervously, aware that this interview had the potential to go viral in a heartbeat. Sensing the precarious moment, Anderson decided to pivot again. But the next question, slightly sharper, was designed to elicit a strong reaction. Barron, Anderson said carefully, there was a period when your mother was mocked for her accent and perceived lack of public advocacy. People compared her unfavorably to prior first ladies. Do you think those comparisons are valid? Barron exhaled, a slight tremor in his jaw. No, it's absurd. She never claimed to want the same public persona as her predecessors. She navigated the role her way, focusing on initiatives that mattered to her. Cyberbullying awareness, for instance. People either dismissed them or attacked them, ironically using the same media channels that amplify bullying. Anderson pressed on. The irony is rich indeed. But some say that if she really cared about bullying, she would have spoken more forcefully against certain statements your father made. How do you reconcile that? Barron's eyes hardened. She never gave me the impression she was afraid to speak up in private. People assume that what they don't see on camera doesn't exist. My mother had her own approach, direct, private. She didn't broadcast every disagreement she had with my father to the world. The studio audience remained silent, though an undercurrent of tension coursed through the room. Anderson recognized an opening. So, are you implying she disagreed with your father on certain issues? Of course, Barron replied. Every married couple has disagreements. It's not a revelation. The difference is, she didn't air it publicly for the sake of sensational headlines. Anderson's face revealed a flicker of respect, but he still pressed. That might be admirable in some ways, but the public often expects a first lady to advocate openly. Don't you think that fed the narrative that she was just there? Barron let out a mirthless laugh. Right, because apparently the only way to be a legitimate first lady is to stand at a podium and feed the 24-hour news cycle with sound bites. She found that notion shallow. She chose her spots. Anderson angled his head. What about your father, Barron? Did he ever express frustration about her lack of public engagement? Barron's gaze narrowed. You'd have to ask him, but from what I saw, he respected her choices. And if you watch enough interviews, you'll see that whenever she did speak, she was measured, direct, and never flustered. Some people hated that because they couldn't pick it apart. Anderson let out a small sigh, glancing at the audience. He was hitting dead ends, yet he sensed there was more to push. Let's shift gears. Some might accuse you of weaponizing your mother's public image for your own brand. How do you respond to that? Barron's jaw tightened. I haven't weaponized anything. I'm merely addressing the endless speculation and cheap shots. The fact that it benefits my public image to defend her, that's incidental. I'd do it regardless. Anderson's next question was more direct. If that's the case, then how do you explain aligning with political commentators who've ridiculed other political families, but bristle when someone questions your mother's role? A current of anger flashed across Barron's face. You're comparing apples to oranges. Criticizing policy or leadership is one thing. Making it personal, sneering at someone's accent, her style, her mothering, that's different, and you know it. A hum of surprise stirred through the audience. This was the clearest hint of anger Barron had shown. Anderson seized on it, pushing further. So you believe your mother's critics made it personal rather than professional? Without a doubt, Barron snapped. Then moderating his tone, he added, Look, Anderson, I'm not here to demonize free speech. I'm here to point out that much of what was said about her was nasty and unwarranted. If you want to question a first lady's influence on policy, fine. But to demean her as some clueless figurehead, that's petty. Anderson nodded, letting the silence linger for just a moment. All right, let's step back and consider the bigger picture. Your mother's chapter in the White House is over. You're forging your own path. Why does any of this still matter to you? Barron's gaze swept the studio audience. It matters because the story persists. People keep distorting who she is. I won't stand by silently when she's mischaracterized. She didn't remain silent for me when it counted. Anderson looked momentarily taken aback. That's a powerful sentiment. Could you give an example when she didn't remain silent for you? A shadow of something more personal flickered across Barron's expression, but he caught himself. There were times, especially in my younger years, when the media singled me out in ways I won't repeat. She fought behind the scenes, making calls, sending emails, ensuring that certain lines wouldn't be crossed. The public rarely saw that. Anderson leaned forward again, voice dropping slightly. And now you feel you owe it to her? Barron shook his head. It's not about owing. It's about respect and gratitude. She protected me. Now I make sure she's not thrown under the bus by people who haven't earned the right to define her. The lights above glinted off Anderson's silver hair as he shifted tactics. The interview was intense, but he still needed a knockout question. Barron, I appreciate your candor. Let's dig into a rumor that's recently resurfaced. Your mother has supposedly been pushing you to consider a future in politics. True or false? Barron's tone stayed calm. False. She's told me to follow my convictions. If that leads to politics at some point, fine. If not, also fine. She's never pressured me to chase public office. Anderson tapped his pen. Would you consider it? Barron arched a brow. That's not my focus right now. I'm dedicated to building my businesses. If in the future I think I can serve effectively, I'll consider it. But it won't be because my mother coerced me. Anderson let out a slow breath, preparing for another pivot. Then let's address the criticisms around your new media company. People claim you're curating content designed to rehabilitate your father's image. Where does your mother fit into that narrative? Barron suppressed a slight grin. The only images I'm rehabilitating are the ones cynics try to distort. My father is his own person. The content we produce is diverse, representing multiple conservative and moderate viewpoints. My mother's involvement is non-existent in that sphere. She's not on my board of directors, nor is she a consultant. People who claim otherwise are pushing a false angle. Anderson's face remained inscrutable. But your family name inevitably shapes the perception of your platform. Don't you think that ties your mother's reputation to your brand, whether intended or not? Barron's hands tightened slightly on his armrest. Sure, people assume everything with Trump on it is an extension of my father or mother. That's not how business or personal identity works. If the media can't separate that, it speaks to their lack of nuance. Anderson tucked the notepad away, sensing time was running short. We're almost out of time, Barron. Is there anything you'd like to say directly to your critics? Barron relaxed his shoulders as though stepping into a final remark. Yes, I'd say, if you want to criticize me, come at me. I'm an adult. I can take it. But cheap shots at my mother's dignity only show the critics' lack of integrity. That's all. A ripple of applause rose from a portion of the audience. Anderson, never one to shy from a challenge, aimed for a last question, one that might expose a crack in Barron's composure. Some might say you're being overly protective of a woman who chose the public eye. Are you sure you're not just trying to reframe a narrative that conveniently benefits your mother's legacy, and by extension yours? Barron took a measured breath. Anderson, I'm protecting the truth. Does it benefit my legacy? Possibly. But I'm okay with that because guess what? I believe in the truth we're defending. Anderson studied Barron for a moment, then looked to the camera. We'll be right back after a short break. I'm Anderson Cooper, and this is AC 360. The stage lights dimmed slightly, the show cutting to a commercial. A low hum of conversation filled the studio as staff rushed around. Barron uncrossed his legs, exhaling quietly. He could feel a bead of sweat rolling between his shoulder blades. Anderson approached, microphone off, offering a polite handshake. You handled that well, Anderson said, voice low. I've seen guests melt under far less. Barron gave a terse nod. I expected nothing less, but I appreciate the opportunity. Anderson's gaze flickered with genuine interest. I wasn't exaggerating. You're good at parrying these questions. Just be prepared. Online reaction can be vicious. Barron's lips curved into a faint smile. I've dealt with vicious before, I'm not worried. A few studio assistants hovered, trying to gauge if they should intervene. One of them whispered to Anderson about the final segment, and Anderson nodded. Then the stage director counted down. The cameras whirred back to life, the bright lights returning. Welcome back, Anderson said, addressing the camera. We're here with Barron Trump, discussing not just his evolving business empire, but also the role his mother Melania has played, behind the scenes or otherwise. Barron, in our remaining time, I want to circle back to one key question. What do you think the world misunderstands most about your mother? Barron folded his hands, gaze steady. They misunderstand her sense of agency. They treat her like she's a peripheral figure who had no choice. In reality, she's one of the most self-possessed individuals I've ever known. Anderson's voice softened. Do you blame the media for that misunderstanding, or do you blame her reluctance to be more transparent? Barron was silent a moment, choosing his words carefully. It's a combination of both, but I lean toward blaming the media cycle. My mother's private approach was a deliberate choice. Media outlets could have delved deeper into her philanthropic work, her achievements, her prior career. Instead, they fixated on superficial details. Anderson glanced at the audience. Fair enough. Let's talk about the future. Your mother is no longer in the White House. You're an adult forging your own path. Is there a scenario where the public sees a more vocal Melania Trump championing your ventures or addressing the controversies that swirl around your name? Barron's mouth pressed into a thin line. Honestly, that's up to her. If she wants to be more vocal, she will be. If she doesn't, she won't. And I respect that completely. Anderson checked the clock. We have only seconds left. Final thoughts? Barron turned his head, meeting Anderson's gaze directly. My final thought is this. You don't have to like my family, or me, but at least respect the fact that my mother has earned her privacy. She's not a punching bag, nor is she a vacant figure. She's a multifaceted person with real beliefs, real influences, and a real sense of self-worth. A beat of silence echoed through the studio before Anderson nodded, turning to the camera. That wraps up our segment with Barron Trump. Love him or hate him, he's certainly given us a lot to think about. I'm Anderson Cooper. Thank you for watching. The broadcast cut. Applause rippled from scattered segments of the audience. Some clapped politely, others seemed genuinely moved. Studio techs rushed in to unclip Barron's microphone. Anderson, maintaining his professional composure, extended a final handshake to Barron. Their eyes met in a silent exchange of mutual respect. Two individuals who knew the weight of public scrutiny. Barron left the stage, stepping into the corridor. A throng of staff parted as he walked past. Outside, paparazzi lights would be flashing, tabloids ready to spin every line he'd spoken. But he felt an odd sense of relief. He'd said his piece, defended his mother, and refused to crumble under pointed questions. That was all he could do. The rest was out of his hands. He'd never planned on becoming a public crusader for his mother's reputation, but perhaps that was inevitable. Whenever interviews brought her up, he found himself bracing for the usual cheap shots. He was tired of it, and it showed tonight. Yet he had no regrets about letting the world see his frustration. In a media landscape obsessed with scandal and optics, maybe honesty would stand out even more. He made his way through the network building, ignoring curious stares. Producers lurked in hallways, whispering about the buzz the segment might generate. Despite the tension, Barron wore a faint smile. He'd faced tough interviews before, and he knew the difference between a fair inquiry and an agenda. Anderson Cooper had been direct, sometimes pushing boundaries, but at least it was honest journalism compared to some he'd encountered in the past. He could respect that. Still, he wondered how his mother might react if she watched. Would she appreciate his fervent defense, or would she roll her eyes at the dramatics of televised sparring? She was never one to crave public acclaim. But Barron suspected she'd appreciate that he stood up for her. He always would. The glass door slid open, revealing the city at night. Camera flashes erupted immediately, tabloids and mainstream outlets alike clamoring for a statement. Barron squared his shoulders, stepping into the fray. Voices shouted his name, each reporter vying for an exclusive quote. Barron, how do you think Melania feels about your interview? One yelled. He gave a polite wave but didn't stop. He'd said all he needed to say on air. No sense in repeating or diluting it. Another shouted, Do you regret anything about defending your mother so aggressively? Barron paused, glancing over his shoulder. Not one bit, he said, then moved on. A cluster of supporters stood off to the side, holding up signs with variations of We support you. Barron offered a small nod of thanks, continuing to his waiting car. Sliding into the back seat, he exhaled. The tension of the interview lingered in his mind, replaying Anderson's pointed questions. But he also felt a sense of satisfaction. He'd navigated the gauntlet, emerging unscathed. His phone buzzed. Messages poured in. Friends, colleagues, even some extended family. Mixed reactions, likely. No interview satisfied everyone. Leaning his head back against the seat, Barron closed his eyes. For years, he'd watched people misunderstand or trivialize his mother, painting her as a side character in a larger political drama. He'd grown up reading headlines that minimized her contributions. Tonight, He'd thrown some sunlight on those shadows, even if only for a moment. "Where to?" asked the driver. "Home," Barron replied, eyes still shut. He felt an unexpected wave of exhaustion, the kind that comes from battling narratives that never seem to die. But exhaustion was a small price to pay if it meant one less cheap shot at his mother's expense. Tomorrow, he'd be the subject of countless tweets, commentaries, and analyses. But for tonight, he just wanted quiet. Home was a sleek apartment high above the city, a blend of modern design and understated comfort. He stepped in, letting the door shut behind him with a heavy thud. The silence was profound after the cacophony of cameras and voices. Barron flicked on a lamp in the living room, then sank into a leather armchair. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, city lights sprawled below like a glittering ocean. He retrieved his phone, scanning headlines already popping up on social media. Some praised him for defending his mother. Others accused him of deflecting legitimate questions about her White House role. He expected that. The echo chambers of the internet would spin the narrative in every direction. One clip in particular was going viral, Anderson pressing him about whether his mother regretted her White House tenure. Barron was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity as he'd answered. A swirl of comments flashed beneath it. "He's so arrogant. Finally, someone stands up for Melania. He's just protecting his brand." He spoke more respectfully than most politicians do. Opinions. Barron tossed the phone aside, letting it tumble onto the coffee table. Sometimes the best move was to detach for a while. Media storms always ran their course, eventually giving way to the next big thing. By next week, someone else would be the headline. But for now, he was content with how things had gone. Anderson Cooper had thrown the best he had, and Barron stood his ground. He rose and drifted into the kitchen, the open floor plan giving him an unobstructed view of the living room and the sprawling windows beyond. Pouring himself a glass of water, he replayed pieces of the interview in his mind. The moment Anderson asked if his mother felt trapped. That was the question that truly ignited him, because it struck at the heart of what he hated. The caricature that Melania Trump was merely ornamental, a voiceless figure overshadowed by bigger personalities. He took a sip, savoring the cool water against the dryness in his throat. He wondered if his father had watched. They rarely discussed interviews these days, each immersed in separate endeavors. But there was a strong chance the family group chat would be lit with opinions. Perhaps he'd check it before bed, or maybe he'd wait until morning. His eyes lingered on the city lights outside, mind drifting to earlier years. He remembered overhearing comments, snide remarks about his mother's accent or jokes about her barely speaking English, which was laughable to anyone who knew how many languages she commanded. He recalled moments in high school when classmates echoed those media barbs. He'd kept quiet then, not wanting to draw more attention, but it always burned inside him. Now, as an adult, he refused to swallow that anger. "Everything changes," he murmured. He set the glass down on the kitchen counter. Indeed, everything had changed. The world saw him now as a business mogul in the making, not just a teenage figure under perpetual watch. And if that spotlight could be used to correct some injustices, even just the ones hurled at his mother, so be it. A memory flickered. Melania coaching him on public speaking before a middle school presentation, telling him to stand straight, speak slowly, and never let nerves steal his clarity. "Be deliberate," she'd said in that gentle accent. "Don't waste words." He'd carried that advice into the boardroom, into life, and now into interviews. Even in silence, she shaped his presence. Barron felt his phone vibrate again. This time it was a text from a close friend who'd seen the segment. The message read, "Dude, you killed it. Anderson tried to corner you, but you hammered him right back. Respect." He smirked. Hammer was a strong word, but he understood the sentiment. Tonight's interview would be dissected by pundits. Some might say he'd come off too defensive. Others would say he was calm yet fierce. Either way, he'd do it again. If pushing back on skewed narratives about Melania Trump made him look aggressive, so be it. Sometimes the moment demanded aggression. Sometimes you had to show your claws to protect those who matter. He padded into the hallway, flipping off lights as he went. He finally reached his bedroom, kicked off his shoes, and let himself relax. Tomorrow, the avalanche of takes would continue, but the next interview might go differently. He had no illusions about a wave of sympathy for his mother. Many had formed opinions they'd never change. But he could at least challenge the stereotypes, refusing to let them slide unopposed. The city lights outside cast a faint glow through the curtains. Barron stared up at the ceiling. People had demanded to know why he bothered defending Melania so fiercely. Why? Because she'd always done the same for him, even when the world wrongly assumed she was too quiet to care. She was a different type of warrior, and that deserved recognition. He thought about calling her, telling her how it went, but it was late. She might be asleep or on a different schedule. He decided to wait, letting the night settle. Nestling into bed, his mind quieted. He had made his stand. He had spoken his truth. Whatever storms might come, he was ready. He drifted off, secure in the knowledge that once again, the world had seen a glimpse of the real Barron Trump, and by extension, the real Melania. The media would spin, the critics would chatter, but somewhere in that swirl, the truth would stand out for those who cared to see it. That was enough for him. He woke to slivers of sunlight beaming through the curtains. His phone was alight with notifications. Beyond the usual barrage of news alerts, social media mentions, and personal messages, there was one text from his mother. He opened it quietly. "Proud of you, thank you." He smiled, reading the words twice. Brief, understated, yet bursting with warmth. It reminded him that while the world debated narratives and agendas, sometimes the simplest exchange meant the most. He typed back a quick reply, something about just telling the truth, and set the phone aside. Rising to face the new day, Barron felt a lightness in his chest. Regardless of the media fallout, he had no regrets. If defending Melania Trump meant showing some fire on national television, so be it. Because in the end, that's what family does. They shield each other from the worst the world hurls their way. He was ready for the next interview, the next challenge, and any question that tried to reduce his mother's worth to a caricature. He would meet it head-on always. Because beneath every public persona, there's a real person with heart and conviction, and in Melania's case, a core of steel that few had taken the time to truly see. Now, perhaps, they'd think twice before dismissing her influence or her strength. And if they didn't, Barron would be there always.